Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Laura.
I'm Kate.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
Today, we're sitting down to discuss Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker, a professor of neuroscience and psychology whose compelling book offers us the chance to be more attractive, slimmer, happier and healthier, all thanks to a good night's sleep. It's an international bestseller and the latest book read by my book club, but what did we make of it? Was it electrifying or soporific? Keep listening to find out. So Laura, how much sleep did you get last night?
Quite a lot. I'm a big sleeper.
How many hours?
Ooh, 10 hours?
10 hours?
Yeah.
Right,
I don't have
good.
children, so 8 to 10 hours is my norm.
Matthew Walker would love you.
Oh, yeah.
I also unusually got a really good night's sleep last night. I got about 9 hours, because I don't normally get 9 hours because I do have small children. For me, that was quite odd because I ended up feeling a bit of a zombie today because I'm not used to getting that much sleep. So much to say about this book. I picked it up originally because my husband is a champion napper. If there was a napping contest, I would enter him straight away, and I think he'd do really, really well. And I've always teased him about his napping. You know, it's like you suddenly look around the room and he's not there, and I'll go and find him just sort of face down on a bed somewhere. And, pre-children, this was like a fond indulgence. Post-children, it's a bit like, what are you doing? You don't have the right to nap. You're not more tired than me. Get up. He always claims that he has what's called a sleep debt. So his theory is that when you lose sleep, you accumulate this sort of debt for the lack of sleep. Anyways, I saw Why We Sleep and I thought, oh, okay, I'll read this and then I'll know if he was right.
You'll have some facts
or not
to counter his arguments.
Yes.
What did you learn?
Well, I think there's so much to say about this book. It's almost impossible to know where to start. And I brought it home and I started reading it and I was immediately captivated. I think the thing that's so compelling about it is from the very beginning, it's talking about something that is incredibly relevant to everybody. You know, from the first line, you think, oh, I do that. Of course you do. Everybody does. But that's why it was so interesting, because it's something that we all do. And yet it's something that we just don't really think about or consider.
Exactly.
And I started reading out what I thought were interesting bits to him. We were having supper. And I ended up reading pretty much the entire first 2 chapters because it is all
stop.
interesting.
What's impressive about this book is how many facts seem somewhat self-evident once you've read them, but you have never thought about it before. They're kind of groundbreaking, mind-blowing. Like, wow, why does no one ever think about that? Of course that's true.
Yeah, so one of the things that kept coming up in book club was just revelatory. You know, you read things and you have this kind of, oh my God, and then you want to tell someone else about them. I found it more so at the beginning of the book. What I really loved was almost the overview and the history of analysing sleep, which actually is very, very recent science, as he talks about, and why we evolved the way that we did. And all of that I found really, really fascinating. And then the middle section, I'd say it's more into the mechanics of sleep and what's going on, which was interesting but more scientific. And then at the end, he comes back to almost slightly polemical, he's really trying to persuade you of the importance, for example, of helping people to achieve better sleep conditions in hospitals, for example. Because if you know, because as a scientist you've discovered that sleep has these extraordinary health benefits, it's almost like then he feels he's got a duty to kind of get out there and try and persuade people to change. If you know that teenagers, for example, have a different sleep cycle and so they need to wake up later in the morning, and that's not because they're lazy, there's a reason why their sleep cycles shift, then it becomes important for you to try and persuade the school system to accommodate that, to allow those children to start later. And so the last third is almost like a campaign, and you're pretty convinced. I think he's very convincing, but it's the sort of thing where, well, yes, I agree with you, but that's not going to change anything. You hope that people who really matter, who can influence people, might read this and that change might come. But I should go back, shouldn't I, and give you a sense of what it's like. And I was going to read a little bit just from the beginning, because I think it sums up quite well that, almost that kind of slightly revelatory aspect. Society's apathy towards sleep has, in part, been caused by the historical failure of science to explain why we need it. To better frame this state of prior scientific ignorance, imagine the birth of your first child. At the hospital, the doctor enters the room and says, "Congratulations, it's a healthy baby boy. We've completed all of the preliminary tests and everything looks good." She smiles reassuringly and starts walking toward the door. However, before exiting the room, she turns around and says, "There's just one thing. From this moment forth, and for the rest of your child's entire life, he will repeatedly and routinely lapse into a state of apparent coma, might even resemble death at times, and while his body lies still, his mind will often be filled with stunning, bizarre hallucinations. This state will consume 1/3 of his life, and I have absolutely no idea why he'll do it, or what it's for. Good luck." Astonishingly, but until very recently, this was reality. Doctors and scientists could not give you a consistent or complete answer as to why we sleep. And then he talks about how in the last 20 years, really what this book is explaining how the science of sleep has evolved and his own investigations. And
then later he talks about how good sleep is for us in every sense of our health, and hence all those claims you're making at the very beginning, it'll make us slimmer, healthier, happier, all of this. And he says actually the real question should be, why did we ever wake up?
Yes.
Everything is better when we're asleep. Our body is way happier, our brain is way happier when we're sleeping.
That's right. And in fact, every moment of wakefulness viewed one way is arguably just brain damage.
Yes, yeah. And it's only really there to kind of feed us and keep us alive, and then really we should just go back to sleep, because that's a much better state.
Because while we sleep, our brains are doing these extraordinary things. And I think one of the things about this is he's a scientist, he's not a writer. And there are some scientific writers who just sort of have an innate gift for writing beautifully. I recently reread *Sapiens* by Yuval Noah Harari, and I think he's a very good example of someone who has actually quite a sort of beautiful lyrical way of writing, in addition to sort of, telling you some pretty interesting stuff. I'm not sure Matthew Walker has it. It's quite simple and clear. What he's very good at is sort of setting up a story or a situation and then giving you the kind of humdinger, and you just sit back and you're like, whoa, he does that very, very well, and he does that again and again and again. But Amanda commented that there's a section in the book where he starts talking about the really intricate details of what they think is happening when we sleep and the different states of sleep, REM sleep, NREM sleep, and these sort of sleep spindles that the brain goes through. And the way he describes it, I mean, she said she sat back and she just thought it was just beautiful, just something really beautiful, that to have that described for you by someone who really understands it, he really conveyed something magical, and she was very struck by that.
He describes dreaming as a neurochemical bath, and that created a perfect image for me. I was like, oh yes, it's a nice soothing bath of neurochemical waves rushing through.
He says very quite charmingly at the end of his introduction, "Should you feel drowsy and fall asleep while reading the book, unlike most authors, I will not be disheartened. Indeed, based on the topic and content of this book, I'm actively going to encourage that kind of behaviour from you. Knowing what I know about the relationship between sleep and memory, it is the greatest form of flattery for me to know that you, the reader, cannot resist the urge to strengthen and thus remember what I am telling you by falling asleep. So please feel free to ebb and flow into and out of consciousness during this entire book. I will take absolutely no offence. On the contrary, I would be delighted." So he's very kind of warm and kind of charming, and he's telling you all this great stuff.
My great difficulty with this book is that I listen to it.
Does he read it?
I don't think so.
Because he's from Liverpool, and it's funny, I just assumed he was American. I don't know why. Well, actually, I know why. It's because he's based in California, Berkeley. So because I knew that, I just assumed he was American. But then later on in the book, it mentions his background, and he's from Liverpool. So actually, it's weird to imagine it being read with a Liverpool accent. But...
Well, it's not read in a Liverpudlian accent, unfortunately, I think, because it's read in a sort of BBC 4 quite stilted formal voice. But that I actually felt was quite at odds with some of his more chatty, almost jokey asides, and I really wish I had owned a copy of the book. I'm kind of looking at yours enviously, because there's so much packed into this. You do want to take notes, and there's all sorts of charts and graphs, which on an audiobook they're just like, see PDF or da 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 da. I'm like, I'm not going to go and pull open a PDF on my computer to see what you're talking about, even as I'm listening to it.
Yeah, it's true. I glanced at the charts and graphs with mild interest, but it was really the anecdotes and the kind of human stories that he uses that brought it to life. I think the bit where I couldn't shut up about it the most was in the early stages when I was reading, where I was particularly interested in this idea that your body has a sort of clock, and so you wake up in the morning and then you go throughout your day, and as your day goes on, this stuff called adipose builds up in your brain. And then when it gets to a sort of sufficient quantity, that tells your brain, okay, now it's time to sleep. And then you go to sleep. And then your brain kind of washes it all away. And then the next morning you start afresh. But if you drink coffee, caffeine attaches itself to the receptors in your brain that that normally would be waiting for the adipose. And this is so scientific. Matthew Walker, you'd be so impressed at
I'm impressed.
my clever summary of your life's work. But it makes like a wall, a caffeine wall. And so it doesn't go away, the adipose. It's all sort of swimming around there. So then when the caffeine breaks down, like sort of 3 hours later, it just crashes over you. And I was just like, oh my God, this is kind of...
I went into work for about 2 weeks with an anecdote every morning.
Yeah.
Like, did you guys know that caffeine stays in your system for 8 hours? So you can't have a coffee at 4 p.m. and think you're going to sleep fine because, it's going to keep you up and it's going to mess with your sleep, as will nicotine, as will alcohol.
I mean, one of the things we talked about was he does sort of catastrophize about the dire consequences of even so much as the loss of an hour's sleep. So say, I think the optimum sleep window was 7 to 9 hours. And if you get 8, I came away from this book with the strong impression that anything in the 8s was basically good. That's golden. You could get away with 7, 9. Wow, you're doing well. But 6 is not good. So if you are in a situation where you just haven't managed to get that much sleep, then the kind of consequences of that are just apparently so catastrophic in terms of your memory and your health and all of these things. You read it and you just think, oh my goodness, take it all incredibly seriously. But really, in functioning life, actually, all the time I have nights when I don't get that much sleep. And I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't have any effect. My memory is shot to hell. So, I'm total proof of what he's saying. But at the same time, I function pretty well, and I'm not a long-distance lorry driver. And, generally...
You're not putting lives at risk.
It's okay. Any long-distance lorry drivers, oh my goodness, please would you read this book, please? There's a very, very, very scary section about microsleeps, which are what happens when people routinely don't have enough sleep. And the body will just take over. And these microsleeps can last for a couple of seconds and you're just unconscious, but you don't realise it's happening. He argues they take a greater toll on human life than drunk driving. With drunk driving, you try to avoid the accident, but your reactions are slower. With a microsleep, you don't try to do anything because you're asleep. So he cites these horrible examples.
I've got stats because I wrote them down as well. So drowsy driving, which I hadn't even really thought about as a phrase, kills 1 person every hour in the US, and it exceeds the total deaths that come from drugs and alcohol affected driving.
Yeah. And I think when you read things like that, you realise why he's so impassioned about it. One of the things he says really early on is the reason that society at large hasn't really taken sleep very seriously until now is because no one really had figured out why it was so important. Now he's saying, look, there's 20 years of research that shows you that it's probably the most important thing that any of us do. And yet society isn't structured around it. We have cultures where we start work early, we finish late, and then we come home and we look at our screens and our iPads, and everything is engineered towards disrupting our sleep. And no one's really considering why that matters.
And how that impacts people who work shifts. Like my husband does, actually.
Does he?
And I was thinking about your husband, too. I mean, I'm sure he naps a lot because he does so much international travel.
That's right.
So he's constantly jet lagged.
Yes.
Which Matthew Walker tells us is the worst thing possible.
I know, it's not good.
Evolution never, ever, ever could have prepared for jet lag. And that's why it knocks us sideways for 2 to 3 weeks, even if we don't think it's that long.
Yeah, and so arguably they're likelier to suffer cancer. They're predisposed towards conditions like diabetes and
then Alzheimer's, which is the really scary one.
Yeah. Like I said, he's very good at telling you the science and then pulling out little facts that help anchor it to your memory. He's a neuroscientist. He knows how brains work. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan famously claimed to get by on 4 hours sleep a night. And he said, yes, that's very interesting, isn't it? And look at what happened to them. They both had Alzheimer's.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, do you not see that bit? And you think, ooh.
Well, so what I did like about this book, you're talking about that 8 hours. How much was it? 6 to 8 or 8 to 10?
I think the magic is a sleep opportunity of 7 to 9 hours, of which if you get 8, brilliant. Okay. Anything in the 8s, good.
So everything in this book, for me, felt very familiar and actually quite reassuring because I come from a family of sleepers. If we don't get 8 to 10 hours sleep a night, we get sick. Like I just spent my 20s being sick all the time because, you're young, you go out on the weekend, stay up till 2 a.m., if I stayed up till 2 a.m. on a Saturday night, I would have a cold by Tuesday. And other people obviously get by on much, much less sleep. And I think Matthew Walker does allow for that, doesn't he? He's like, people do need less sleep than other people.
Yes. Are you a lark or an owl?
Just a sleeper.
But do you...
He does allow for the middle. I think I'm a middle.
Yeah, I think I'm a middle, actually, and leaning slightly towards lark. So, but this is a real thing. Are you an early riser or are you a late riser? And again, this goes back to this really interesting thing at the beginning about how we evolved. And he poses this very sensible question, which is why on earth would nature have programmed us to spend 8 hours unconscious? It's bizarre if you think about it. When we're unconscious, we can't be running around getting food. We're vulnerable to predators. There's a thing he talks about. Originally, we were in the trees, of course, monkeys. He's saying that one of the significant steps in our evolution was when we came down out of the trees, and then we were able to sort of stretch out and kind of relax finally. We didn't have to worry about falling out of the tree when we fell asleep. So then there we all are, and we figured out that we need to be in caves, so we're all in caves. But for 8 hours a day, everyone's asleep. And so there's one argument that seems pretty persuasive, that to avoid the problem of everyone being asleep at the same time, what happened was that certain people evolved to be slightly later risers and sleepers, and others were earlier. But he points out that society is very unfair on the poor owls, because society is basically structured around the larks. We have to get up, rush out of the house, we have to get to our jobs, we have to get to school, all this kind of thing. And the poor owls, they're only really just getting going by about 10 a.m.
Yeah.
And for them, their most kind of productive time is the early evening.
And it's so funny because it's such an easy thing to fix in certain types of jobs. And certainly flexible hours are now being brought in a lot more.
Yeah,
so
he makes a really good case for that.
Yeah, so that's kind of 10 to 4 core hours, but then people can figure out if they want to do 2 or 3 hours before that or 2 or 3 hours in the evening. That's really easy to introduce in office work. And it certainly just makes a lot of sense even for like commuting and like congestion. But what about people who need to work in the evening? And the fact too that people who work shifts are often lower paid, higher stress jobs, and it's having a direct effect on their health, and there's no easy solutions to that.
Yeah. Well, again, it's that thing where you just hope that people who are in a position to make policy changes might read this book, and because ultimately, the benefits of getting it right are so enormous.
We haven't even talked about mental health.
No.
And obesity.
So if you've had a poor night's sleep, you are far more likely to crave high starch, high sugary foods the next day. And you're more likely to be subject to depression and to mood swings. And
that neurochemical bath, it kind of washes away the emotions that you've had throughout the day and lets you start afresh the next day. When I heard that, it made me think of people who suffered from an extreme shock, like a death in the family, a death of a loved one, and they just stay in bed for weeks and weeks. It seems to me that that's the brain saying, no, we just need to sleep this trauma off.
Yeah, maybe. I think one of the things that happened to me when I read it, and to all the people I just bored on about it too, is I made everyone quite paranoid about sleep. Suddenly it became a real thing about it mattered so much how much sleep you got. I've calmed down about it now, but I think what I was left with was the feeling that sleep is a good thing. It's a healing thing. It's a healthy thing. Your brain is very busy when you're sleeping. You're not wasting time. In fact, you're being incredibly productive when you sleep. And in our kind of productivity-driven society, thinking about it that way almost allows you to say, okay, I need to prioritize this. This is good. This is good for me. This is good for everybody. And so I'm not quite counting the hours the way I was.
It makes you rethink your own behavior. He says humans are the only animal to purposely deny ourselves sleep. And when you think about that, you're like, right, that is weird.
That's
Why
true,
do we do that?
Like sort of what, like pulling an all-nighter or
just going to bed later than we should.
Yeah.
I do read before I fall asleep, but if it's a good book, I'm not going to go to bed at my bedtime. I'm like, I want to find out what happens next. Other people watch movies, watch TV, or just stay up late because they have things to do, when actually we're tired enough to be asleep. We should be sleeping.
Yeah. I find, for me, only time I get that's really like me time, when my children are in bed, everything's quiet, is that time late at night. And so what I find is because it's so precious and just lovely, then there's a real temptation to say, I'll just have one more hour. And then before you know it, it's 1 a.m. Oh, disaster.
Does anyone in your book club suffer from insomnia?
Yes. Amanda, who I've known for a long time. And so I knew that she had some issues with sleep. And I was a little bit concerned when we decided to read that. She wasn't at the book club where we picked it. Or she was, I don't remember her saying anything. No, I don't think she was there. But I remember emailing her and just saying, I wonder if you should read this. I don't want it to make you really paranoid. Because the thing is, if you're someone who struggles to sleep and you read this and you find out the really damaging consequences of not getting enough sleep, is it going to make you feel worse? She thinks it depends on what your worries are. She said if you're more of a kind of hypochondriac type where you're really just lying there worrying about sickness and death, then yes, this would be quite unhelpful. She said her worries are pretty much like sort of stress and work related. So she didn't really feel this kind of enhanced them or anything. And actually what she said was it was so interesting knowing everything about what the brain was doing. I don't know. I think it allowed her to think in a different way about what's going on at night and her own struggles.
And he gives the advice that you shouldn't stay in bed fretting effectively. give it 20 minutes. And if you haven't fallen asleep, get up, go do something nice. I just wondered, as someone, I don't suffer from insomnia, but if I did, I'm like, well, does that just mean you'd stay up till like 3 a.m. wandering around your house? That doesn't seem better necessarily.
Yeah, it's a good question, because I've just never really suffered from insomnia. So like you, I'm a sleeper.
It does take me a long time to fall asleep. It usually is like 30 to 50 minutes, I'd say. Rolling around, pondering life, slowing down. Whereas, I mean, bring up our husbands again, but they're our main comparisons, right, for sleeping. My husband just falls asleep in like 30 seconds.
Well, and to talk about, my husband, the champion sleeper, this thing about, the worst thing you could possibly do is sit there looking at a blue light screen before you go to sleep.
Yeah.
He always does that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, the blue light. He just looks at me like I'm mad, carries on checking Twitter blithely for like 10 minutes, and then just puts his phone down and, as you say, goes straight to sleep.
Does he have bedtime on his phone?
Don't know.
So do you know what bedtime is?
No.
I'm not sure Matthew Walker even does, because he brings this up as something. He says we should really have alarm clocks telling us when to go to sleep, not when to wake up.
Oh, I missed that.
And I was
nice.
like, well, that's what Apple bedtime is.
Oh.
So basically you set Apple bedtime and it turns your screen to a yellow light, probably like 2 hours before your bedtime. And then you get a little gentle alert when it's your bedtime and you should be asleep to prompt you, to get into bed and get on with it. And then you do have, obviously an alarm that then reoccurs Monday to Friday if that's what you set it up. It's really good.
That does sound good. The bit about alarms, did you get to that bit? So when he talks about,
did.
so basically the effect that a morning alarm has on your poor sleeping brain, it's just about the worst thing you could do there. It's like basically hitting it with a sledgehammer. And then the worse even than having an alarm in the morning is snooze. Apparently that's the worst thing you can possibly do, because your poor brain, it's just jangling over, all its nerve endings and neurons are jumping around because of this alarm that's just gone up. Just about manages to calm down. If you snooze, it's like, oh, it's all gone away, and it settles and settles, and then it all happens again. It's just like you're repeatedly giving yourself like electric shocks in the morning to get yourself out of bed. So, do you want to know what my book club thought?
Well, you've given me teasers, but go on. Tell me all.
Most of us were sort of like me, very, just sort of bubbling over with, facts and things you want to talk about. And I think it was a really, really, really good book club book, because it was so relevant to everybody. There's no one who read that book who didn't find something to take away. And we had a really good time discussing it and the different degrees to which we cared about it. Stuart, who we're hoping will become a regular member, but he joined us for this one. And he really just said, this book had changed his life. He said he comes from a family of poor sleepers, and I think he realised that he just needs to completely rethink his whole approach to sleep. And also he was quite kind of proactive about wanting to take it into his office. And, you were saying, you were talking about different flexi time and people being able to maybe snooze at work for 20 minutes or whatever. I think he was going to start campaigning for that. I got the impression. So for him, it was revelatory. Sally was the dissenting voice, because I think she just felt she was being lectured to. She felt a lot of it was a bit self-evident. And for her, it just was a bit of a slog getting through it. But she was the minority. I include that because I think it's just to show, obviously it's not for everybody. But overall, I think we loved it. We totally loved it. It was great.
I did love it. But like Sally, I found it a slog. And if I haven't made this clear already, I've only got about a third of the way through. And I did feel that he gives away a lot in that first chapter. So you get a real comprehensive overview of everything you're going to learn. And then as it moved into the other chapters, I was like, right, I already know this because you've told me the best bits. And now we're just going into a lot of science that, because it was an audiobook, I found a bit hard to follow. I
think that's true. I think there's definitely an arc to it. And I would agree. I think the most compelling page-turning bit is at the beginning. And then if you're interested enough in that kind of carries you through the sort of sciencey bit in the middle. And then almost like the campaigning bit, the arguments at the end were really interesting. But that's also, in a way, something where you feel like you can't really do anything about them. None of us are responsible for hospital lighting systems. The fact that nurses need to bang around and make a lot of noise.
Well, I was going to say, though, hey, in a few years, in a little while yet, you're going to have teenage girls. And now you will let them sleep.
Yes.
Until 11 a.m.
Yes. Having read this, I will understand that their sleep cycles are going to be different to mine, and that actually for a growing body and brain, it's really important that they should be able to sleep. So I won't tell them, but
you won't encourage this behaviour.
I'd like to think that, yes, we will move our lives around to accommodate them.
So an exciting read with lots of revelations.
I think that's good. Yeah, I think it was an exciting read, and I would recommend it to absolutely everybody. But I did think it made a particularly good discussion book. It was a great book club book. Inspired by Why We Sleep, here are some recommendations for your next book club read. Laura, what have you got?
I'm very excited to recommend Happiness by Design, Finding Pleasure and Purpose in Everyday Life by Paul Dolan. Have I talked to you about this book before?
I think you made me read this book once.
I'm quite evangelical about it.
Well, let me just tell you this. I may have enjoyed it at the time, but none of it stayed with me.
Well, funnily enough, that doesn't bother me too much.
Pleasure and Purpose.
Pleasure and Purpose.
Yes.
So,
something did stay with me.
There we go. So Paul Dolan is a behavioral economist at LSE, and he is a great character. He writes with real personality and flair, and he's quite funny and gets into his own personal background as well, even as he's heading straight into behavioral economic theory and what that means for happiness. Now, his thesis is that happiness should be understood as the relationship between pleasure and purpose. And we all have our own perfect balance when it comes to that. Some of us are real pleasure seekers, and we don't need much purpose in our life. And hey, great. If that makes you happy, wonderful. Other people need to feel like they're working towards a goal or that they're, achieving something and they're a bit more purpose driven. But of course, it's about a balance and there's a huge range in between that. The reason why I recommend it is because kind of like Why We Sleep, you read it and you can't help but indulge in some navel gazing and starting to think about your own life. And although it is a serious book in and of itself, an examination of happiness theory, it's also a bit of self-help, practical scientific self-help. But there's checklists that look at different areas of your life. At the very beginning, he says, look at these areas of your life and rank the ones that you think would contribute most to your happiness. And we'll come back to that towards the end of the book, because he wants you to think about how activity and what you do impacts your happiness. Happiness isn't a constant state. It's a feeling that fluctuates throughout your day. And so you need to examine what it is that makes you happy and what doesn't, and try to find a way to bring things into your life that would help contribute to this happiness. Sounds quite abstract. He's actually quite concrete, I think. And although I don't think it would help anyone suffering from a mental illness or depression because it's too proactive and practical, it's a really interesting reflection on what makes us tick and how you can take control of your own happiness.
You're selling it to me. I obviously need to reread it.
I've reread it before, actually.
And I think, to be fair as well, books like that, you don't remember everything because there's usually a lot in them. And it is the sort of thing where you might come back to it and read it again. And I think definitely worth it.
It's a good one. And it would be a really good book club book because there's a lot to discuss.
I am going to recommend some fiction, offset all this non-fiction. In Why We Sleep, there's a little paragraph about a case of a man who suffers from an extremely rare disease that means that he cannot sleep. And I found it so haunting. The reason Matthew Walker includes it is because he is citing this as an example of the fact that actually lack of sleep has a proven effect on our health. And if you take that to an extreme where a person can't sleep at all, then what happens is they become sick and then they die. And it was just a little thing in the book, but it just did haunt me. And for some reason it brought to mind a novel I read a few years ago that I really loved. It's called The Unnamed by Joshua Ferris. And it's about a man who has every appearance of a comfortable, successful life. He's a lawyer, he's reasonably affluent, he has a wife, he has a child, they travel, they sort of have a nice time. And he becomes afflicted by this strange ailment that means that he has to walk. He basically can't sit still, and he has to sort of leave all this behind and walk. And it sounds like a really strange premise for a novel. I don't know if Joshua Ferris saw some snippet somewhere about someone this really happened to. It was a strange thing, like, why would you write a novel about this? But what it explores is the things that drive us and perhaps things that affect us without us knowing. I don't know, there was something really poetic and as I say, haunting about this. It has stayed with me. I read this quite a few years ago, and I do remember it in that way that so many things we read just sort of dissipate. Whereas this, I really kind of lived that book while I read it. And I don't know why, but I think it was that idea of this compulsion and things going on that we don't understand. And for that reason, it reminded me of this novel, which I recommend. I think it would be a very interesting book club read. And the other one is slightly more obvious. We've talked about it on the pod before. Ottessa Moshfegh's My Year of Rest and Relaxation, which I don't think we ever did for book club, but I read it and then we talked about it on one of our bookshelf shows. Did I get you to read it after that?
Yes, you did, yes.
It's such a great novel about a girl who is beautiful and has everything, all the advantages she needs in life. She has money and the world is her oyster. And she's just so sickened by society really in general that she decides that what she really wants to do is spend a year unconscious. And so she starts to experiment with different forms of drug that will allow her to sleep and sort of evade a year of her life, with the goal that after she's done this, she's going to emerge and hopefully things will be different.
She's going into hibernation.
Yeah, and kind of like, proactively using the idea of sleep, what seems like an unbelievably passive state, but kind of proactively using that to say, no, I'm going to step away from it all, and when I come back, maybe things will be different. It's such a brilliant book. It's just so full of nuance and pointed jabs at things in society that, just exist. And
I think it'd be very divisive as well, so it'd be a great book club book on that front.
And it's quite funny in a very dark way, but genuinely very, very funny.
We do also know now from Matthew Walker that she is not sleeping in any way, shape or form.
Because she's drugged.
And sleeping pills and all drugs are very, very bad.
And maybe what she needed was just some more nice...
Some real sleep.
8-hour healthy... I don't know. Who can say?
Who can say?
But that probably wouldn't have made such an interesting novel. So yes, 2 fiction recommendations that I think would make for great book club books. That's all for this episode. On our next book club show, we'll be discussing 2 classics of African American literature. If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin and A Different Drummer by William Melvin Kelly.
The first is a moving Harlem love story, and you'll likely know the title as it was recently adapted into an Oscar-nominated film. The second, on the other hand, is a forgotten classic, first published in 1962 and only recently resurrected thanks to a glowing New Yorker article.
The big question is, will these make for good book club books? You will have to listen in to find out. In the meantime, keep an eye out for our next bookshelf episode, where we discuss what we've been reading outside of book club. And coming soon is our latest interview with Simon Thomas, book blogger and fellow podcaster. He tells us all about his online take on a book club, where he and his fellow book bloggers read books from particular years in the 20th century. It's the book club equivalent of time travel. Listen in to find out more.
If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com.
Don't forget, you can email us anytime to tell us about your book club. We'd love to hear about it.
And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts?
Books mentioned on this episode include Happiness by Design by Paul Dolan, My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ortessa Moshfegh, and The Unnamed by Joshua Ferris.
That's all for this episode. Thanks for listening and happy reading.